I put together some thoughts, some links, some connections between some of the questions that have been raised. We can keep this relatively organic. If there are additional questions that come up connected to outcomes, then we can address them. I'm going to start off by talking around some of the items that haven't been highlighted or circled or anything on this chart, because those I'm just going to take some sort of anecdotal answers to. I haven't had time to put together materials to support those answers. Some of them will be enfolded into some of the other answers as we go through. So I think I'll start with the why Scopus question, because is that still a question? Hands up if that's still a question following Shadi's presentation. I'd like to add a personality dimension to the why Scopus question. They're just nicer people. It's a bit of a generalization, obviously. They're both big organizations. But when we were working with Thomson Reuters in the Web of Science in the early years, they were very standoffish. They're very difficult to get in touch with, very unwilling to provide transparency into their data sets and how everything worked. When we started working with Elsevier, we had a very different experience where they were very keen to help us and our stakeholders understand the metrics and the data and the systems and the projects that they were using. And that, in addition to the statistical perspective that Shadi was able to share, has made them a much more fulfilling and rewarding partner than we had with Thomson Reuters as they were at the time prior to that. Now both organizations have evolved over time, so I don't know if we've got any Thomson Clarivate analytics people in the room. That's a relief. Good. But they are both changing and both responding to market needs. But that was definitely a factor in reforging the partnership. One of the other questions that often comes up, and maybe this is in the undertone of the question that was asked about Scopus, is why only Scopus? And there's a good reason for that in terms of comparing the Web of Science, and Shadi's slide did a very good job of that, which says, well, almost everything that's in the Web of Science is in Scopus anyway. It would be very difficult to unpick and deduplicate given the size of those two databases. So the only way to use both would be to double count to quite a significant extent. The other question is, why not use anybody else? And the answer to that is, well, we're open to suggestions. If we can find an entirely Spanish language research index or an entirely Arabic language research index that is mature enough and ready enough to provide compatible metrics, then we're open to discussion. And indeed, we've been talking in that direction with Elsevier, because Elsevier are keen to onboard better metrics about what's happening in the regions as well. So it might end up being a sort of three-way partnership if we find the right platform. We have had nascent conversations with organizations that are beginning to work in that space, but they haven't yet come to pass. But it's particularly interesting if we can identify an index of research that's happening in a local language that specifically isn't covered by Scopus, so you don't have the double counting effect. And I imagine there are various Elsevier products that would be interested in absorbing that kind of insight as well. Size, I'll answer that question now. Size does matter, but how much it matters varies greatly between the different rankings that you've decided to refer to in performance management and measurement. If you are fixated on the Shanghai ranking, as appears to be the case for anybody in France, then you are going to spend 15 years figuring out how to merge your institutions. And what you might end up doing is improving in the Shanghai ranking, but losing ground in other rankings, because size isn't everything. It matters, but it isn't everything. What we've tried to do throughout, where we can, is neutralize size. So we do citations per faculty, because that tends to be relatively size independent. We do international student and international faculty ratios, which indeed tend to lend an advantage to smaller institutions that can influence their scores in those areas more easily. An institution of 1,000 students can go out and get 20 more students and make a significant difference. An institution of 10,000 or 100,000 students, they go out and get 20 more students. It doesn't make any difference at all to those ratios. So we found that quite often small institutions have advantages in things like faculty-student ratio, international students, international faculty. It's pretty much even in citations per faculty. And in the reputation measures, the size of an institution is in your favor, because you'll have more alumni, more employers out there, more academics working at other institutions, and therefore large institutions do tend to have a little bit of an advantage in the reputation measures. When you look at the overall outcomes, we have Caltech and ENS Paris and various elite small institutions performing reasonably well within the top 20, within the top 50, within the top 100, and within the top 200. You compare that to the Shanghai ranking, and if the small institutions really don't float to the surface very well effectively. So we're thinking about size. I'm not saying we're completely neutralizing the impact of size, but it is there, and if you compare our ranking to other rankings, you'll tend to find that excellent small institutions do better in QS. And to a certain extent, Times Higher Education. Caltech has been number one for many of the iterations of the Times Higher Education ranking than they do in the more overtly research-oriented rankings like Shanghai. Teaching and learning. Obviously, I haven't highlighted that question, and it is the big question. There's quite a lot going on in the sector. Obviously, the Teaching Excellence Framework was mentioned, and it's a great example of an excellent of an initiative that is titled and headlined around teaching, but actually, when you look at the detail, doesn't really look at teaching very much. And why doesn't it? Because teaching is extremely difficult to look at in terms of quality. It's a qualitative thing, and you can't sit in a representative subset of everybody's lectures in the world and everybody's tutorials in the world to understand what's really going on and how good it is. I've often referred to it as the Holy Grail in international rankings. It's something that everybody really wants to find, but nobody knows whether or not it really exists, that concept for measuring teaching. Times Higher Education are labeling various things as teaching, such as a survey of academics who've never been to universities about how good the teaching is at universities, which correlates extremely highly with the evaluation of academics evaluating research at universities that they may have familiarity with. So there's an assumption that if you have good research, you must have good teaching, which doesn't necessarily follow. It does sometimes occur, but it doesn't necessarily follow. So to go to your question about that sort of strategic formula between teaching and research, there are often questions, very good questions, that there isn't one answer for a room like this, because all of your institutions are different, and if you all pursued the same strategic formula, you would all be trying to do the same thing, and trying to do the same thing as everybody else is probably the one thing that shouldn't be included in a strategic formula. So if your strengths are in teaching, it's important to try and find out how to leverage that. If your strengths are in research, it's important to find out how to leverage that. And I've highlighted this in green along with the young collaborating with the old, because that sort of young versus old continuum in some way is similar and in some ways maps across to that teaching focused versus research focused continuum. Generally speaking, research focused institutions are old, teaching focused institutions are younger. I mean, there are obviously exceptions, and there are probably exceptions represented in this room. And how those two pieces can work together in order to be the rising tide that raises all ships is a very important consideration for policy, I think, for how different kinds of institutions can work together to meet the different requirements of their individual society and raise the capability and caliber of an institution's system. If everybody is trying to be Harvard, then there are going to be a lot of there are going to be a lot of disappointed people, but there are also going to be a lot of stakeholders whose requirements aren't met, because Harvard doesn't do everything that the higher education sector needs to do. So that sort of touches on some different pieces. I'm going to roll this back and talk a little bit about QS. Why QS? That big question in the top left. And how does it compare to others? And the very flattering question from the back of the room about how is it that we've overtaken everybody else and become more popular? That obviously is a matter of opinion. And I'd very much appreciate you attending one of Times Higher Education's events and asking them why QS has overtaken everybody else and is more popular. Nonetheless, you can look at that from different lenses, different markets, different places, different sectors. There may be an argument to suggest that other rankings are more popular amongst certain groups. But if we look at the sort of top-line headlines, and I quite like, when I'm answering these kind of questions, to flip out to third-party analysis. So this is not a matter of opinion. This is somebody else in the world who's looking at this question from a certain perspective. So I don't know if you're familiar with Alexa. Alexa essentially maps website popularity. So this is topuniversities.com, which the principal function of which is to present the results of the ranking and various supporting articles. It is currently ranked amongst all websites. That includes news websites, university websites, corporate websites, amongst all websites in the world, as the 4,233rd most popular website. Woo! That may not sound that impressive, but there are a lot of websites in the world. So let's see how this compares to one of the other rankings. The ranking where the Shanghai ranking, the website where the Shanghai ranking sits, is called shanghairanking.com. So we find their result, 47,275th. So there's a step change in difference of popularity between those two websites. Interestingly enough, the big three rankings are Shanghai, Times Higher Education, and QS by most definitions. The Webometrics ranking is interesting, not because it's necessarily considered in the same breath, but because it covers so many universities. So 20,000+ universities are featured to some extent in Webometrics. I've got the URL wrong there. It's .info. So they're at 29,914. So interestingly higher than the Shanghai ranking, which tends to be talked about. So it's interesting that distinction between sort of popularity in certain circles and genuine flat footfall. Webometrics tends not to be considered and taken very seriously in this kind of a group of people, but it is being looked at by a lot of people in comparison with, say, Shanghai. So Times Higher Education, bearing in mind they have a weekly publication, it's not .info, it's .com. And when the internet wakes up, I'll correct that. TimesHigherEducation.com is 8,464th. Now, as you can imagine, Google has quite a lot more traffic than topuniversities.com. You know, it's one of the top websites in the world. But there is an exponential scale. So to get from 8,000 to 4,000, you probably need to have about double the amount of traffic going through your website. So it gives you a sense of, in objective terms, website popularity traffic. QS is the most popular international rankings website in the world. US News and World Report's website is around about 1,000th in the world, but that's principally driven by its domestic ranking and its huge popularity within the US situation. They obviously do now produce an international ranking. Those pages don't get very much traction within the context of their website. So that's just one way of looking at QS compared with others, just in terms of flat footfall popularity. There are other ways. There's the Hobsons Report that relatively recently concluded that the QS ranking was the most popular of the three big rankings amongst a couple of others. But there are a lot of rankings out there, you know. So actually, I'm only really talking about comparing with the most well-known 3 or 4. But I think this has gone up to 20 now. 20 different organizations producing global rankings of universities, slightly different purposes, different approaches, and the three that we typically talk about are these three. This is sort of presented in chronological order. And this is the outcome of the Hobsons Report, which conveniently, and I will be honest, was not influenced by us, conveniently was published before we acquired the business. We obviously can no longer continue to ask people objectively in a QS survey, which is the most popular of the three rankings. But at the time this was conducted, it was independent of QS. And it mapped a trajectory over 3 years. We don't necessarily think that we weren't the most popular the previous 2 years, obviously, but this is based on a survey of prospective international students, predominantly with interests in going to either the UK or Australia. That's the construct. Now, obviously, that means students from lots of different places that are drawing these conclusions, but in particular those that have perhaps got that UK-Australia lens, where the majority of the Hobson survey participant institutions are based. There are other ways to look at the survey comparison, and this is old analysis. It's not 100% up to date, but it gives you a flavor. Shanghai, for instance, has extended its list to 800 in 2017, and THE indeed has gone past 1,000 with their 2017 results. What you can see is that from a results perspective, the middle top box and the top right box, the results are actually remarkably similar. It's a little bit pathetic for any one of us to get up and talk too badly about any of the other rankings that are out there when they all more or less at a macro level conclude the same thing. Now, for your individual institutions, you'll be higher in one than you are in another, and no doubt you will think that the one that you're highest in is the best one, because that's the general psychology that universities look at these rankings through. But overall, at a macro level, they're all at a 0.7, 0.8 correlation, which indicates a lot of similarity, and the higher you go up the table, the stronger that correlation tends to get. There are 330 institutions in the top 500 of all three rankings, which again demonstrates that sort of overlap. So the answer to your question is that it's not because the results are wildly different. That's not why one is more popular than another. And we tend to go a little bit deeper with our specific ranks. We go to 400, Times Higher I think goes to 200, Shanghai goes to 100 in terms of its specific rank. Recently, despite suggestions to the contrary earlier on, recently QS has been amongst the most stable. Even Shanghai, that has been traditionally extremely static, almost immovable, has had to make some changes to its ranking, partly thanks to the people at Thomson Reuters who've changed some of the metrics and made things unavailable that were previously available, and as a result they've had a bit more churn. I think one of the key reasons is the bottom right, that QS is more inclusive. We have more countries featured, and that's partly because we don't have a hard threshold for research publication. THE has a 1,000 paper minimum threshold for participation in the World University Rankings, and that's 1,000 papers in Scopus. So if you're producing lots of local language research, or if you're a teaching-focused institution, it can be very difficult to access. And therefore we've got more people in more places talking about our ranking, and that creates a sort of incubator that has helped to drive interest. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, slightly obliquely, the business schools. Is the person who was asking about standalone business schools still here? Right. So business schools actually are the founding pillar of QS. The company was founded in 1990 by Nunzia Quacquarelli while still an MBA student at the Wharton School in Philadelphia. And the first product was a catalogue of MBA programs called the MBA Career Guide, a publication that continues to this day. So that's sort of where our pedigree was originally. MBA rankings in particular have become very popular. The Financial Times does one, US News and World Report does one, The Economist, Forbes, Business Week, America Economia. There's a list of business school ranking. It's MBA rankings specifically. And we used to do, and still do, an employer survey, and we produced metrics out of the most popular MBA programs for employers. That was a little bit one-dimensional. It didn't get that much attention. And in 2017, we went further. So I've got a few more slides in here, which I haven't linked, apparently. So in November, we launched a set of specific business program rankings. We were already doing executive MBA programs, distance online MBA programs. We've relaunched full-time MBA rankings in November, as well as Masters in Management, Masters in Finance, and Masters in Business Analytics. We are looking at, for 2018, also doing Masters in Marketing, Masters in Accounting, and Masters in Management Information Systems, I think. So we're sort of building out a portfolio that gets to business schools in a much deeper way, in fact, than we are for any other type of institution. And the main reason for that is that a huge proportion of prospective international students are interested in business and business-related fields. So it may be in time that we drill those sort of program-related rankings into engineering and other popular international fields. We've started with business, partly because it's our pedigree, partly because it's a big share of the international mobile student market. This gives me an opportunity to answer another question that came up, which was about a systematic approach or something that changes for each ranking. Well, I'd argue we do both. You know, we have a sort of founding DNA where we want to look at reputation. We always want to look at employability. Every ranking that you will not find a QS ranking that doesn't include a measure of employability, because we think that's fundamentally important to our key audience, those people we're talking about in our mission statement. So in this context, you can see that the ranking methodology is not the same. Not exactly the same. The colors represent sort of different themes, but they carry slightly different weights for different programs depending on the availability of data or the suitability of data in the individual context. In John's slides earlier, you saw that subject by subject, we're taking a systematic approach but applying a differential methodology across different subjects based on which ones are more research active, research intensive, which ones are not. There isn't very much research going on in English language, for instance, so we can't place as much emphasis, if any, on citations and H-index in a subject rankings context as we could for medicine, which is extremely rich in terms of the research documentation. It's the same here. We look at employability, employer reputation, and employment rate. In the first section, we didn't get enough good data for Masters in Finance and Masters in Business Analytics on the employment rate side. Masters in Business Analytics is very new for a lot of business schools, so they haven't had that many graduating classes, so getting employment rate data was difficult. We look at alumni outcomes. This is a new measure which also informs our graduate employability ranking, which some of you may be involved in, where we track influential people through a variety of lists, and we identify where they got their bachelor's, master's, MBA, PhD, and we attribute value to the institutions that contributed to their education. Then we have a return on investment measure in a business program context. A lot of people going to business school, they really want to know, well, what's this going to do for my career? So we've got some statistics in that context. Thought leadership, so we've still got academic reputation in there. Just because it's a business school doesn't mean that it's not important what they're contributing to the thought space. And then finally, international is the final context, or diversity in this context, where we've gone into gender diversity as well, which is an area of concern in the sort of business education context. So what you can see is a different methodology. So depending on where you're coming from, you could declare that not to be a systematic approach, but you can see a lot of the same themes are cutting through all of our different mechanisms, and the same surveys are feeding different rankings in different ways. So I'd argue that there's a balance between a systematic approach and a context-sensitive approach that means that you're actually measuring things that are relevant for that program, for that subject, for that region. And as a result, we've got variability in our approaches. So I'm going to talk now about the million-dollar question a little bit, the how do I improve question. That was asked in a couple of different ways, how rather than what, and some success stories down there at the bottom, and in the top right, directly, how to improve. So, again, I don't know why. So these slides are from a few years ago, but the recipe hasn't really changed. I put together this material for an equivalent event about 3 years ago, essentially saying this is a recipe for how to build an improvement strategy for your university. It's a simple recipe, but it's not an easy recipe. 5 simple ingredients. And how was it formulated? Well, we, at that time, we took a look at who were the fastest risers. So you want some success stories. Here's a good list. Most of them would still have recognized a fairly stratospheric rise. But at the time, these were the 10 fastest rising institutions between 2009 and 2014. MIT right at the top. It had always been in the top 10, but moving from number 8 to number 1, well, that's quite an impressive percentage increase, but maybe not a great example for all of you to attempt to emulate. Sung Kyung Kwan University. Do we have anyone from Sung Kyung Kwan? No. Do we have any Koreans in the room? Yeah, there's a couple. So they will have seen Sung Kyung Kwan's rise in a domestic context as well, to a certain extent. And Korea University is also on the list there. But quite a diverse list. So it's not necessarily a formula for improvement to be Korean or be German or be American. There are good examples of strong growth across the piece, strong improvement in the context of our rankings measures. But we looked at these institutions and we said, well, what have they got in common? What are the things that seem to be resonating from the approach that they've been taking over the years? And this is how we broke it down. The first ingredient, good, agile, effective governance with limited political interference. In some countries, maybe some of your countries, the political landscape can have too aggressive an effect on universities, and that means that they have to change direction every time there's a new leader or a new political party in power. It tends to work more effectively where universities have got a degree of autonomy. Quite often young universities are improving more quickly than old universities because they've got greater agility, greater sort of energy to move. They need to have a degree of control over their own finances and where they spend it. They need to be performance-driven but mission-led. In general, the universities that are improving most in rankings are not the universities that have written rankings improvement into their mission statement. They're universities that have identified a broad spectrum of required improvement, and rankings are just picking up what they're doing to improve against their own mission rather than to pursue rankings metrics directly. Focus is critical. Not everybody is Harvard. You can't be world number 1 in 16 subjects very easily without a 30 billion plus endowment and 200 years to get underway. Most of you, I imagine all of you, have neither of those things. So for the most part, there's a requirement to focus financial resources. You can't, if you get $1 million of extra funding and divide it democratically amongst every department, every division, and every academic, it's not going to make very much difference. If you have some way to say, okay, we're going to assign this to 2 key research initiatives, then maybe those 2 research initiatives can really get some traction. Maybe you could get industrial funding for those research initiatives and develop a source of income that you can then invest in the next focus. So what we're seeing is institutions that are moving quickest tend to be those that are able to focus on priorities in sequence rather than consecutive. One of the best examples is Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, that has gone up very strongly in our rankings and would probably be even higher on that list if we were to redo this on today's data. They very much focused on a number of research focuses, channeled funding, attracted faculty into those, and then leapfrogged, and now they're in a situation where they've launched a medical school with Imperial College, and they wouldn't have been able to do that if they tried to do it all at once. Those potential points of focus also provide focal points for collaboration. If you are fantastic at one thing, then sometimes it's better to figure out how you can use that as the basis for partnering with other institutions that are strong at something else, rather than trying to build that internal competence. Branding. Most of the universities that have moved up quickly have figured out that they need to take branding seriously. It was 15 years ago a dirty word in universities. Oh, that's something from the private sector, from corporations. Branding doesn't really matter in university spaces, but it does. You look at NUS, you look at NTU, you look at a lot of those universities that have moved up the quicker. They've thought about their name, how well it resonates internationally. Sung Kyung Kwan University tend to go by SKKU internationally because they figured out that international audiences are not going to remember Sung Kyung Kwan. They're not going to remember how to pronounce it, how to say it, and therefore if we're talking through that brand, we're going to struggle, and therefore they've taken the shorter form. Colours are resonant. Do we have anyone from NUS? What colour do you associate with NUS? Anyone? It's blue and orange everywhere, blue and orange. And every business card, every brochure, every sign on their campus, and you begin to recognize it. You can see it across a room, even if you can't read it, because you begin to associate with those colors. So branding is important. It helps your recall, and it means that every marketing and PR dollar works harder for you because people connect the dots. Collaboration is critical. Shadi talked about collaboration in some detail. I've got some other slides in here that talk about that. You cannot do it alone. I had a meeting with a Russian university 2-3 years ago, and they said, we've already got the #1 biochemist in the world. Why would we want to collaborate with anybody else? And I said, well, maybe he would be able to achieve more if he was working with the #2 biochemist in the world rather than a bunch of lab techs that aren't at the cutting edge of the field. That collaboration enables you to really solve the problems that universities were put in place to solve. In a reputation context, it creates resonance. That different academics, different employers around the world, if you're collaborating, you begin to open yourselves up to the stakeholder groups of other institutions and magnify your recognition. It's important to collaborate with institutions that are better than you. Everybody knows that. It's also critical to collaborate with institutions that, at least in rankings terms, are weaker than you. Does anybody have an MOU with a top 10 world university? Yeah, there's one there, right? So how much do you talk about that to your stakeholders? A lot. And how much do they talk about their collaboration with you to their stakeholders? If you're lucky, yeah. So collaboration is complex like that. You're doing a lot of work for them. You're promoting them, you're talking about them, you're telling people that they're active in the region and they're open to partnership. You're singing their praises. You're telling all your students, this is an amazing university we're partnering with. And you walk around their campus, and would you know that they partnered with you? But it's harder to achieve. So just from that point of view, on its own, it's worth having a diversity of partners. Almost any institution that expects to rise quickly, they need to take a leadership stance. And you don't do that by saying, oh, well, you're ranked lower than us, we're not helping you. Apart from anything else, The reality is that almost every institution, if not every institution that is ranked lower than you, is better than you at something. And maybe that could be the germ of the partnership that you form. And finally, the most important component is patience. All too often, institutions expect immediate results. They expect, to put a strategy in place and in 6 months, 12 months, be able to see the difference. The Vice Chancellor, who's there for 4 years or 5 years, he wants to see the difference in his own tenure. Well, probably he's going to enjoy the fruits of his predecessor's strategic maneuvers rather than his own. For the most part, strategic changes in universities will begin to take effect 3, 5, 10 years down the line. And if you're changing your strategic direction every 3, 5 years, you're never going to bear the fruit of the previous strategy before you are already changing direction. So having thought about strategy and laid down some key pillars of it, it's really important to be consistent and let it bear out and let it help redefine the identity of an institution. Institutions that change with the times too much, too quickly, and flip-flop, they tend not to be the ones that are moving too quickly. Good tactics, good strategy, and then stick with it and be patient. Back into those slides now. So that was a simple sort of improvement recipe. Now, obviously, for any of you in the room specifically, that will apply in very different ways to your institution. One of the biggest criticisms of rankings over the years has been that they appear to be designed to homogenize institutions, to try and make them all look like the world's best institutions. If you think about it carefully, that's not really what's happening with QS and to a lesser extent Times Higher Education, because the reputation piece is so important. And reputation isn't just about being the same as everybody else. In fact, it's more about being distinct from everybody else, being memorable for something that you do or some dimension, some characteristic that you have. So institutions that suppress their history and their tradition in favor of looking like everybody else, they're putting themselves in a much more competitive frame. So at the same time as you're trying to design strategies and follow a secret formula for success, it's really important to hold true to your original identity, the thing that sets you apart from other institutions, and perhaps develop and further invest in that. There's a question here, how does the QS ranking improve performance? Who asked that question? I mean, it's a great question, and the simple answer is it doesn't. Not at all, if you don't do anything about it. We have no control over what you're doing at your university. What it can provide is it serves as a diagnostic tool in the dimensions that it covers, whereby you can understand your performance in a bit more depth, in combination with some of our more in detail sort of consulting and reporting services that are commercially available. You can get an even deeper diagnostic. And the same is true, though, that you could buy every product that QS offers, and it's still not going to improve your performance if you don't do anything with it. Really, performance improvement is in the hands of the leadership of the university, and we can help guide and provide information and make strategic suggestions, but if they're not acted upon, then there's going to be no change. That sort of goes without saying. So we don't sit around saying, how can we improve universities' performance? We do spend a lot of time sitting around saying, what information can we surface that could help the right institution at the right degree of readiness to implement improvements within their institution. One of the most important things when we get involved in that is to try to take into account your local and policy reality. So we meet a lot of universities who've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars on having PwC come in and tell them what they should improve, and they'll go into a Saudi university and say, well, you need to introduce mixed classes. And the Saudi university will say, well, we can't. What is the point in paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for recommendations that you are unable to implement because of the policy environment that you operate in? And some of you may have experiences of that, and that's a simplistic example. But if your paying a lot of money for advice, you expect that advice to be applicable to your individual situation. And we do see situations where institutions are bringing in expensive brand name consultants who haven't adapted their approach from the private sector to the university sector. And quite often we find that institutions haven't got value for money from that. We only deal with universities. So we are pathological about making sure that the recommendations that we put forward are applicable in the individual context of the institution that we're working with. I wanted to talk about the not Forbes question and combine that with the how do you develop energy around, within an institution to do something about all this. Because those are a little bit connected. It's just another marketing initiative. They're just making money off putting together data and selling advertising on their website. We should forget about that. And you need to overcome that objection if you're going to use any of this data constructively, whether or not it's from Shanghai or from QS or from anybody. Obviously, Times Higher and QS get varnished with that sort of media marketing exercise buzz more than Shanghai does. But the simple truth is that it is, in part, it is another Forbes list. If you were a company, you could look at the Forbes ranking and say, well, okay, what does this mean for us? I mean, obviously, it's designed to sell magazines originally and to attract web traffic now. And I'm not going to be dishonest with you and say that we're not producing these rankings in order to attract web traffic that we can sell advertising to. It's absolutely one of the objectives why QS started this. And it would be disingenuous of me to pretend it wasn't. But that doesn't mean it's not useful in other contexts as well. And quite often I find that one of the best ways to get people to get over their objections is to agree with them. You might notice I just did that. So the truth is that it does have that dimension, and we are there. Now, we have high standards for how we do this. We take our responsibilities very seriously. So we don't look at a set of results and saying, oh, well, this is a bit boring. Things aren't changing enough. Shall we change the results just for fun to sell more newspapers? We don't do that at all. And that's an important input to that question about whether it's just for marketing purposes. Can we rely on this data to be conducted consistently from one year to the next? Now, we do try to make improvements, so year-on-year comparisons can sometimes be tricky. But from my point of view, it's not about saying we're not Forbes, because that is a dimension to it. It's a dimension actually that creates some of the importance, because if millions of people weren't looking at this stuff, then it wouldn't be important, it wouldn't matter, it wouldn't tell you anything. The fact that is happening does indicate that we're capturing something. It's similarly important not to overblow what it is measuring. It doesn't cover teaching in any precise depth. It doesn't look at service service in the community. It doesn't look at that third mission, as it's often referred to in a QS context, as well as it could. So it's quite important that people who are using our rankings drill down and figure out what it's measuring quite quickly. Having said that, and this feeds into a few different pieces, where we've seen it used most effectively is quite often as a culture change catalyst within an institution. Kevin, he's not in the room at the moment, but Kevin Downing, who's here and is chairing the main conference, he's worked for many years at City University in Hong Kong, another good example of an institution that has improved quite dramatically over the years. And one of the things that he talked about was that rankings have helped make a conversation about performance within a university possible, because people are worried about how the world sees their employer, their institution, and that served as a starting point for having a conversation about, well, let's look at performance. Let's introduce targets and key performance indicators and things within the university to try and drive performance, not performance against the ranking. Although the rankings fed into some aspects of the performance model that they built at City U, it was probably less than 15%. They said, what else is important to us? How can we use this sort of catalyst for culture change to install a performance culture that looks at a range of things, not only including those things that are in the ranking. So I think one of the things to deal with in that sort of not Forbes and trying to develop that energy is to say, this is what a ranking is good for. We agree that it's not good for this and this and this. Is one of the fears is, we're just going to become all about this ranking and we're going to lose our sense of identity. The universities that are moving the best in the rankings are the ones that have figured out how not to use rankings as well as how to use rankings. And I think that's quite important and can serve to reassure some of the internal critics within an institution that they're not going to be used in the wrong way. Collaboration. I've talked a little bit about that young-old dynamic, but I'll talk about collaboration in the round a little bit more. This is what collaboration looks like at a lot of universities, particularly Asian universities. I've found there's somebody at the university, past or present, who is going around the world almost all of the time, visiting vice-chancellors, talking to universities, signing MOUs. Woohoo, we've got 1,000 MOUs. Right, well, what do any of them do? We've got 1,000 of them. Well, a lot of them are inactive. A lot of them aren't really doing very much. If you went to the university that a lot of those MOUs were with and said, have you got an MOU with this university? They'd probably say, I think we met them once. Well, that's not really a partnership. That's not collaboration. That's just collecting paper and putting it in a filing cabinet and letting it gather dust over the decades and saying, well, last time I talked to anybody from this university was 23 years ago, but we've got an MOU from back then, It's just counting paper. And I understand that counting paper seems like a good idea. It enables you to put a statistic on the front end of your website that says you've got 150 or 276 or however many the number is. But in reality, collaboration is about doing things. It's not about saying that you're going to do things and then never doing them. So I'd say that for a lot of institutions, it's a good idea to really strip back. What does it mean to be a partner of your university? Are there some minimum requirements? At what point of activity, when it drops below a certain point of activity, do we scrub it off the list? Because if anybody asked us a question, the answer we would have to give would be a bit embarrassing. Focusing on a smaller number of very active partnerships can yield genuine results rather than just collecting paperwork. Increasingly, universities that are tactical, the universities that you would like to partner with, they're not going to accept an MOU just as a piece of paper. They're going to expect it to do something. So maybe you should get ahead of that. In my view, there is a need for institutions to take collaboration from both directions. Look at what your faculty are already doing organically. Use that sort of bottom-up approach as a starting point and build that as a nucleus around new partnerships at the same time as driving top-down incentives to encourage your academics to partner and collaborate more effectively. It's vital to performance in rankings. Unfortunately, many of you will face this kind of reaction from academics who aren't particularly enthusiastic about sharing credit. That collaboration is not necessarily a habit. It's not necessarily in their DNA. And that requires training, coaching, smart recruitment, all sorts of things to gradually change the culture of your university to one where they're more prepared to collaborate by default. What else do we have? Covered that. Business school rankings, how to improve. Oh, support. The question about support and potentially having a hotline. Good idea. We always like to take at least one or two good ideas away from a room like this. We have evolved the support. We used to just have an email address, and people would write to the email address, and, well, if nobody was checking that email account on that day or that week, their email would get pushed down the sequence. It wouldn't be put into a tracking system. We wouldn't allocate it to a specific person to respond. And at peak times of rankings, we'd be okay at responding. And in the quiet times in between rankings, well, nobody was checking the account, so it was pretty unreliable. So we implemented a ticketing system. You've clearly been receiving the odd ticket that may not have all been responded to. I can provide you with a sense of the level of activity that's going through that. This is our online support desk, and these are tickets marked closed in the last month or so. You can see the weekends very clearly down here. We don't close too many tickets at weekends. Some of our people are working at weekends, but not at the same level of capacity. And you can see that we're peaking at various times at 100 tickets closed on a particular day. That's a day. 102 tickets there, 85 tickets there. So what's happening now is that we are a lot more responsive than we used to be. I'm not saying that we're closing every ticket. You can see at the top here, this is live. There are 434 unallocated tickets in the system, because they're coming in at an astonishing rate. We've just launched a ranking at the moment, so it's particularly intense right now. Normally we aim to keep that at a running total of less than 100. Sometimes things do get missed. If we could add a hotline to that, it's not a silly idea. We need to figure out how to do that. It's theoretically easier now than it used to be because we've got data teams not only in one time zone anymore. We do have Samuel in Singapore. We have Ajita and Anuja in Mumbai. We're looking at potentially adding some staff in our new Kuala Lumpur office at some point over the next 12 months. The problem with the hotline when everybody's in London is what happens when you have a problem in India or a problem in Singapore and there's nobody around to pick up the phone. So we're moving towards a situation where things are a lot better. I'd be happy to take your specific situation on board personally after the session. A hotline's not a silly idea. We need to figure out the technology to do it well. Okay. So future plans, perhaps. In fact, I'm going to just talk about accreditation briefly, and then I'll go into future plans, and then that might be pretty much all we have time for. Did you have an extra question? Yeah, accreditation. Right, so how do accreditation and ranking fit together? There's another dimension to the sort of triangle, if you will, that I'll introduce, which is ratings. So QS has QS star ratings, which provide, based on a much more in-depth audit, provide a range of ratings. And we sometimes refer to that informally as a graduated accreditation. There is a problem with accreditations. There are a lot of advantages to it. There's a problem, which is that it's pass-fail. You either get the accreditation or you don't get the accreditation. So institutions that are so good that they don't have to care about it, Harvard, they don't bother getting the accreditation because everybody assumes they would be good enough. So the accreditations often give it to Harvard at no charge. And institutions that are a long way short of the accreditation mark, they don't bother investing in it because they're pretty confident they're not going to get it. So the star rating provides a sort of staircase model, if you like, that if you're rated at 1 star, well, you can figure out how to get from 1 star to 2 stars and then from 2 stars to 3 stars, which might be about the pass point for an accreditation. In a rankings context, we sometimes use, particularly for the program rankings, for instance, we'll use accreditations in the business space as a pre-qualifier to make sure that we're dealing with decent programs from decent schools. If a program for our distance online, the school needed to be either EQUIS, AMBER or AACSB accredited in order for us to consider the online programs, and we're interested in other forms of accreditation to serve as a sort of validation baseline for inclusion, particularly when we're going down to a program level and it's harder to look at the validity of an institution at a top level. And there are a lot of for-profit players that begin to get in, particularly in the distance and in the online education space. We're looking at that much more closely than we are in other contexts. There's also sort of government accreditation, which occasionally gets raised. We use accreditations in our star ratings, but we don't tend to include government accreditation because government accreditation is usually the minimum standard required to operate. which is not necessarily a measure of quality that we want to look at. It's just a basic prerequisite. So we see that as being something slightly different from accreditation at a particular quality standard. So it dovetails. In general, you're not going to see programs that aren't accredited or universities that aren't accredited or at the top end of a rankings table. For the most part, we're looking at 1,000, 2,000 institutions. There are 20,000 in the world. So most of the problematic institutions that are out there that are perhaps for profit, that are doing things that they shouldn't, they're not even on our radar at all at the moment. Accreditation is one of the tools that we use to verify whether or not an institution deserves to be considered in the context of any of our rankings. And I'll just move to future plans, as I think I've pretty much covered everything else on here. I'm here until Tuesday evening, so come and grab me if there's a question that you don't feel I've answered very well, or if you've got a specific question beyond that. Sorry? I mentioned size at the beginning. I talked about how... Okay, just let me just talk about that. Obviously, you've got your own specific situation, and in this kind of format, we can't answer every question from a very specific standpoint. The size issue, it varies between different rankings and different studies. We've made various efforts, built them into our design to try and ensure that the influence and impact of size is not too significant. And I gave the example of comparing, Caltech's performance in Shanghai versus in QS, or ENS Paris, which is a very small institution that's a traditional top 30 in the QS ranking. Therefore, if you compare QS initiatives and look at small institutions, they're generally doing better in QS than they are in other ways. And when you look at our top level dimensions, small institutions can be stronger for faculty-student ratio, for international students, for international faculty, and more agile. But size is definitely a factor in building reputation, for instance. So we definitely haven't got the equation absolutely perfect by any means. It's better than most of the other players in the game, I think. But there are ways that we can hopefully improve that over time, and we're interested in engaging with institutions of different types and structures to talk about that in more depth. There was also a question there, and I think you raised this one as well, about local versus international. And I haven't answered that very well, if at all. To a certain extent, if your sphere of influence is predominantly local, and you're happy with that, then being at an international conference like this to try and figure out how to be more international and how to partner and how to improve in rankings and various other things is possibly not in line with the acceptance of that reality. So I suspect that most locally oriented unis that might be asking us that question are asking that question from a point of view of how do I make the transition from local to regional to international, because there's a sense of ambition. Otherwise, why would your university approve you to go to international conferences? I do think there is a question about, from a policy perspective, about universities trying to push all of their universities to be internationally competitive when actually they need a proportion of their universities to serve the local economic and human resource development requirements. So we can talk about that in more depth, because the perspective of local unis is interesting, something that we've not been wired into that effectively. I get the sense that I haven't satisfied you guys on that, so let's take that offline after the session, because I'm conscious of the time. I don't want you to all miss the bus. I'm going to wrap up on I can see the hand going up. We will talk about whatever that question is. I'm just going to cover future plans for a moment, as it seems a good way to sort of close out the session. We're always looking for the next opportunity to surface excellence. in whatever dimension. We're interested in looking at innovation. We're interested in looking at sort of ecosystems around universities and maybe seeing if we could rank that. We're interested in looking at what you're doing online and how MOOCs are influencing your classroom environment and what's happening in terms of teaching drive and how that fits together with all other aspects of performance. Reimagine Education Awards and Conference have been fascinating and inspiring over the past 4 years, and I encourage any of you who are doing exciting things around teaching to go to reimagineeducation.com and look at that awards program and consider putting forward your best initiatives. Again, in many cases, it's the universities that are most progressive on teaching that are also having traction in terms of brand and innovation and distinctiveness and moving things forward. So that's all in train. In terms of specifics, we are definitely looking and are interested in understanding the US more, not necessarily to be another game in town, but because everybody wants to know more about the US. Our international stakeholders want to understand how to access partners at the right level to help them. And they're not just the ones that are in the top 10 or the top 100. So we're interested in looking at that in more depth. We've started looking at international high schools. You know, what is the supply chain of talent coming into universities? You know, what are the best high schools for getting kids into the best universities? That's a dimension that we're looking at. We're beginning to look at social media profiling and media profiling and what universities are doing, both in business schools and universities more broadly. So those are the general directions. We don't have big announcements. Future plans are certainly to do more subjects in more depth. We've done a piece of work on energy specifically, which we're hoping we will release in a few weeks, which is an interdisciplinary piece of analysis. So we've got this great cohort of subject rankings that we've just released, 48 different disciplines. One of the feedbacks is, well, what about interdisciplinary stuff? And can we pick out? So we've devised a sort of beta test methodology for how we would pick information from different subjects, revalidate that against the research record and say, well, let's look at energy, let's look at robotics, let's look at a variety of interdisciplinary subjects, and that's quite exciting. And then to drill down deeper within the subjects, both to more institutions and maybe with the big subjects where there's a lot of complexity. And so architecture, I think we currently publish 50 or 100. In computer science, we're publishing 400, and we could probably publish 600 or 700. Well, that implies that computer science could maybe be subdivided into particular disciplines within computer science, and the research record in Elsevier is strong enough to be able to subdivide computer science, physics, medicine, a few of the big subjects, so that we can provide even more deeper detail at a subject level and surface excellence for even more institutions in more dimensions. So in a small nutshell, that's the general sense of direction that we're pushing in, to try and find out and provide tools whereby more institutions can shout about the things that they're great at. Watch this space. As a closing remark, we spend a whole afternoon talking about rankings. Well, actually, rankings isn't the objective. The objective for all of you, the objective for us, is to get better no matter where my ranking is. And if we keep that in mind, then hopefully rankings can be a useful tool. If we lose sight of that, then quite often they can have less positive results. And some contact details for you to take down. I've got no business cards. Snow, I blame the snow. They were on my desk. I expected to go into the office for 3 days at the end of last week and grab my business cards to bring out here. In the end, that wasn't a possibility. So if you want to contact me afterwards, my email address is there, the first one in the second row. That's the best means, and the various social media contacts and stuff like that as well. So take a note, and I'd be happy to hear from you after the event. Thank you.